the stat that I love is that more years have been added on to average life expectancy in the last 100 years than in all of the previous millennia combined.
Yeah.
That's wild. And what that suggests is we're not kind of set up to think about the very long term because we never had to.
In this, our 10th episode, I've had the privilege to sit down and pick the brain of Hal Hirschfield, Associate Professor of Marketing and Behavioural Decision Making at UCLA University in California. Hal's research fits so well into the essence and the themes of our podcast. We discuss the research that explains how a focus on time versus money can impact happiness, how our short-term decisions are impacted by our connection to our future self, and the relationship that exists between wealth and happiness. Thanks for listening. All right, so Hal, nice to have you on. As I was saying to you just before, it was a funny kind of connection in the sense that I came across an article with a local financial advisor who did something pretty out there, which was institute a 5-hour workday. I actually then picked up a book. I started researching a little bit and then found your evidence and your academic research out there and made contact with you. So it's nice to have a person who's actually looking at the evidence and the science around, happiness, money, time, all of those things that I've been exposed to as a financial advisor. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, cool. So I know that you're an associate professor of marketing and behavioral decision making at UCLA. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, sure. So I am, I'm actually a psychologist by training, social psychologist, and so my academic appointments are in marketing, and we call it the behavioral decision making area, which is really a collection of researchers who study, how to help people make behavioral changes, right? And so, in my day job, if you will, I teach the intro marketing class, but largely speaking, my research is really surrounds how people make long-term decisions and how we can help them make quote unquote better long-term decisions, better by their own definitions, and how people sort of weigh time against money and these sort of fundamental decisions that impact them both now and in the future. So that's it's like in a nutshell. That's my That's my
why go down that route? What was the precipitating factor like?
Oh, that's good. Well, it goes all the way back to when I started in grad school. My graduate advisor was this woman Laura Karstensen, who's one of the world's experts in studying aging and decision making and what sort of things happen in terms of our emotions and decisions as we get older. I was particularly drawn to work with her because I fundamentally, these are questions about how people think about time, which just is exciting to me. That's just something that I'm into. And one of my very first meetings with her, I was probably 24 or 23, 24. And, we're talking about possible research topics. And she said, I think that you should study retirement because not enough people have anything to say about retirement. And I said, that sounds really boring. I don't want to do that at all.
That's my whole world, Hal.
and well, I should back up, and I said, that's really boring. She said, well, listen, that's the problem. Younger people don't think of this as something that they want to talk about or think about, and we've got to say something about it. Psychologists need to say something about it. And I'm glad I listened to her because it honestly got me down this path. And I realized this is actually really interesting because I had been thinking, study retirement. I'm going to look at, retirement communities and golf memberships and these sorts of things. And then I realized this is so much bigger than that. This is how people make plans. This is how people make trade-offs between life now and life tomorrow. And it's also about how people think about balancing out what they want now and in the future. And when you put all those things together, it becomes a very interesting and difficult problem to solve. I mean, the reality is, once you start working on these things, you say, well, if my work is really good, then will I solve it? And then there won't be any more problems. Well, I think the reality is there's going to be a lot of, there's always going to be work to be done in this area, because as long as there are people in retirement, there'll be issues to solve and advice that can be given, I think.
True. So for the benefit of the listeners, just to give a little bit of dimensionality, tell us a little bit about your family and the sorts of things you like to do outside your research, and that contributes to your meaning as well. Obviously, your research is very meaningful, but outside of that, what do you like to?
Yeah, I love that question. Well, so, we've got two little kids. One's 5 and one's 1.5. So that basically means a lot of my time is spent trying to figure out the balance. Oh, we have a dog too. So I feel like a lot of my time is cleaning up poop. But other than that, in non-COVID times, I actually love cooking, and I've really gotten into smoking, barbecues.
Yes.
Right? So that's really been, and I love it because there's a end result, but it takes some time, and it's a good excuse to stand outside for anywhere from 3 to 16 hours or whatever.
Talk about delaying short-term gratification for long-term meaning when you're smoking a brisket. I mean, you and I are actually online with that, because I've got a big Kamado, Big Joe, and it's not because my name is Joe, but I've got one sitting in the backyard, and I love my smoking as well, and I'm all into the American barbecue, surprisingly, as an Aussie. But
I was going to say, yeah, no, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah. But So, but it's funny though that you asked this question, because as I've how it happens as you get older, as you start being in a position to make these sorts of decisions, you start asking, well, what do I want to do with my time and my money? And that's important, right? Because that really boils down to.
It feels like at this point I could say it's kind of everything. Like, the time is like so much.
Exactly.
And it kind of leads me to my next question around, how does thinking about time actually transform our emotions and the judgments we actually make?
Yeah. Well, so, I think this is a big question, obviously, And,
Yep.
Let me tell you, when I started working in this space, what I was particularly drawn to was this work by my graduate advisor, Laura Karstensen, who she did a very important discovery, 25 years ago, which was basically looking at older people.
Yep.
And realizing something kind of funny, which is that their social networks get pruned, right? We all know this. Older people have fewer friends, and they don't have this wide social network. And yet she was finding out that they were reporting higher emotional well-being than their younger counterparts. And this presents a mystery, because you say, well, aren't they lonely? Aren't they depressed? Aren't they wanting friends? And then no, that's not it. What it is that they see that they are closer to the end of their lives. Time is becoming compressed and limited. And when that happens, that transforms their decisions and their emotions, because what they do is they prioritize feeling meaning and feeling good. Not, by the way, I don't mean to say when time is compressed, we're hedonistic. That's not what's happening.
No.
What's happening is that when we see time as being limited, we focus our attention on the things that matter and the things that are meaningful. And so this to me became kind of like a guiding, I don't know what the right thing to say, but this became somewhat of like a guiding star for my research, which is to say, let's look at what happens when people face different time perspectives in their life, when things are limited, when they're expansive, and how does that impact their decisions? Because at different times in our life, with different ventures, with different stressors and life stages, time sort of expands or contracts, and what does that do for our decisions? That was really what was guiding my research.
You're
So, yeah.
saying is that like, as we get older, there's a kind of almost like a fusion between our current self and our kind of future self, or it's the gap is narrowing, and then therefore we've got more skin in the game in terms of like making decisions now that are actually going to potentially benefit us down the road, which in an older person with an older person that down the road may not be as long.
I think that is exactly right. And I love the way that you just put it. There's that fusion there, right? And, also, by the way, I might argue that there's even a fusion with the past too. I think that this is all speculation, but my guess would be as we get older, I don't know if you've felt this, but I feel very close in a way to who I was when I was in college 20 years ago. And yet I recognize that a gulf of time has existed in there, and I'm a different person now. And yet I still feel, youthful to some extent. When I talk to my undergrads, I start talking to them as if, yeah, we're all kind of young. And I realize, oh my God, I'm 20 years older than them. They don't really think of me as young.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. And it's like a lot of our friendships and family members and relationships that we have, people tend to have a kind of view about who you are based upon, their impressions and based upon maybe, a person that you were not, maybe not too long ago. I think we continue to evolve. So
I think, you know what, that is fascinating. And it's also, by the way, this is one of that insight right there is one of the things that arises as a problem in long-term relationships sometimes. There's this great philosopher, Alain de Botton in France, who has this line where he says, you married the wrong person. He doesn't really mean you married the wrong person, but he says, we marry somebody and we expect them to stay that person. And yet everyone changes. And so the problem comes when we don't recognize change in others, and we also don't recognize it in ourselves. But we do. People like stability. And so I think, you think of your cousin you haven't seen in a while. They're the same cousin they were when you were younger, but they're not, of course.
They're not. They're not. Yeah, that's true. How can we start like valuing our longer term selves over the short term?
Yeah. Well, to me, this is one of the trickiest questions to answer and the hardest problem to solve, because so many of our decisions, especially when it comes to money. Yes. I know it's not about the money, but I know
tongue in cheek that line on the podcast, but yeah.
Yes. So many of our decisions boil down to this trade-off and this balance between, now and later. And by the way, now and later could be, now and tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
But it obviously also can boil down to a much bigger question of now and retirement, or now and 10 years from now. You got kids and you're thinking about college for them, or you're starting out and you're trying to figure out, do I want a slightly bigger, more less expensive house out in the suburbs, or do I want to prioritize living in the heart of the city, and that's more expensive and it's smaller, but and these decisions are fundamentally about trying to interpret what I'm going to want and value in some future period of time. That could be in a year, it could be in 5, it could be 10 years, right? And it's so hard to do because we change and we can't totally anticipate our feelings. And
so does it mean we just don't do anything at all? Do we decide to actually have a look at the future? Do we decide to try to work out what we look like, who's around us? What are we smelling at that time? Is there a worth in that?
Exactly. And so a lot of the research I've done has I think pointed to the idea that there is some worth in this, right? There is some worth in trying to, show people what they'll look like. Get people to really step into the shoes of their future selves. These sorts of exercises take the perspective of who they'll be. Because I think, at the end of the day, if you do nothing, if you bury your head in the sand and you do the sort of ostrich move, most likely, and that's extreme, right? I don't really truly believe anybody does that.
No.
But I think they may act in ways that kind of look like that, right? Which is to say they might really, really, really strongly prioritize the present over the future. I think
Yep.
it's going to end up with some, anxiety and stress and suboptimal outcomes over time. But uh, uh, I think it's worth noting that the reverse is also true, right? If you must have clients who, you, well, I don't know, maybe I've talked to other financial advisors who say they have some clients, definitely not all of them, but some subsegment, and they say, spend your money, do something with it, because you're hoarding it away for what? And that's some future that, like, what are you gonna look back on that?
They are actually the most challenging conversations that I tend to have, because I can see, that there is the financial resources and the backing, and I can see that there are things that the client really, deeply wants to do, but there's an unnerved, there's a kind of feeling of being unnerved by it. There's a deeper insecurity or an emotion there. And, I feel somewhat responsible for that in terms of like trying to tease that out and trying to encourage moving forward. So yeah, absolutely. Definitely. That's the case.
To me, these conversations, kind of boil down to balance, right? Which is, you've got today, you got tomorrow, and what's the right balance to strike? I've been talking to undergrads this quarter. I'm teaching a small class with about 20 undergrads, and you forget when you're 18 years old. I forgot how much stress they have about who they'll become and what they'll do and whether things will work out. And I want to say to them, hold up a second, stop for a minute and appreciate everything right now. Like, it's not going to all work out if you don't do anything. Like, if you just say like, screw it, I'm just going to live for today. That's not going to work out. But you got to have some balance, because you don't want to look back and say, oh my God, I spent all of college worried about what life would be like. And I recognize right now is a particularly anxiety provoking and worrisome time.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Do you think there's a few challenges that we have in being able to see ourselves in the future, like around the way that our world is, capitalist society, big business, marketing and advertising, and creating insecurities for us to actually, really ensure that their profits are being made in the short term. And that can really kind of, I suppose, distract us from, who cares about that long-term guy? Like, I need this right now. Do you think it's really about businesses being more responsible around the way they actually market to us? Or do you think it's about the personal responsibility?
Well, that is a great question. I mean, there's a couple of different ways to approach this. One is, yes, for the large part, I think so much of capitalistic society is short-term focused. The credit card industry alone has made that the case. Same day delivery or next day delivery has, upped the ante on this as well. We have a number of different pressures that make it, or rather, a number of different temptations that make it very easy to engage in short-term gratification. And not delay our gratification, right? Now, that being said, to the extent that so much of sort of the corporate world is focused on showing me what you've done right now, you're only as good as your most recent, win. Then it like all of these things are sort of converge together, I think, to really amplify this kind of sense of like focusing on the now and not paying attention to the later. Now, you say, well, whose responsibility is this? And this is so tough because, I'm not so idealistic to say, well, let's change all of marketing and let's change corporate, the corporate world, and at the same time, I'm also not so idealistic to think that people have the bandwidth and resources to do this all on their own. I don't subscribe to the notion that people are somehow lazy, dumb, and naive, and they can't do it. I think everyone can. They can delay gratification. They can stave off short-term impulses. It's just really hard because they have so many other demands on their time and their mental bandwidth, and it's hard to sort of exercise all of that self-control all the time continually.
Well, I mean, I think, when you think about, if you've seen The Social Network, I think it was called, or is that what it's called? The Social Dilemma or Social Network on Netflix?
Oh, The Social Dilemma. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it's our biology played against us. in so many ways in terms of the way that, our phones we're addicted to our phones and addicted to sort of social media, and the advertising that comes through. It's like, what sort of a chance do, people have to be able to really kind of, combat that? That's a big challenge, don't you think?
I absolutely do. I think about one of my favorite research studies looked at judges in Israel, and basically maybe you're familiar with this study. They looked at their parole decisions throughout the day, and the easy decision is to not parole someone because it's less risky, and the hard decision is to give someone parole and let them out. And basically what you see is, as the day goes on and as they get closer and closer to a meal break, they're more likely to not parole. That is, they're more likely to go with the easy choice and send someone back to prison for a period of time. Now, there's nothing different about those cases. It's not that the harder cases happen right before lunchtime or dinner time. It's just that the judges are hungry. And I bring this up to say, someone as rational or as supposedly rational as an Israeli judge making decisions about prison versus freedom, if they are swayed by hunger, it's like, well, what chance do the rest of us have?
It kind of talks to how powerful that part of our brain is, the kind of what they call the limbic system, kind of like really.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And I think that it just shows that we are multiply determined creatures. There's a lot of different forces that affect our decisions and our behaviors, and we've got to appreciate those when it comes to these sort of big decisions, like whether I should spend or save, and apartment or condo or house to buy, these sorts of things.
I think it's really kind of interesting for our listeners to actually understand your research a little bit more at a granular level, because your research indicates that the brain sees the future self as another person quite disparate to who we are now. Why does this happen?
Yeah, so this is great. I'm glad you asked this. So basically, the research that I've been engaged in for the last 10 years or so starts with this idea that we think of and we sort of treat our future selves as if they are different people. And so we even have this sort of, I think, compelling evidence that in the brain, we see our future selves in much the same way that we see other people. In other words, the sort of same patterns of brain activity arise when we think about our future selves as when we think about you or another person, right?
Yeah.
Now that to me is I know you asked why, and let me just say something before the why. Let me say why that's important, because this is an important thing to think about when it comes to trying to understand why we so often fail to do the things that we want to do. So, you say, I want to exercise more. You say you want to eat healthier. You say you want to save more and spend less. And all of these consequences occur to some future version of you. Well, if that future version of you seems like another guy, another person, another woman altogether, then like, who cares if I have just a little bit more chocolate cake today? Or who cares if I go for the nicer 4K TV and don't have as much to put away into my retirement account? Because that future person is a stranger, and so that's the kind of starting point of a lot of this research. Now, why this happens, that's your question. That to me is like the, I don't know, $1 billion question. I mean, what is a question worth these days? Is it $10 million, $1 billion? It's worth a lot, right? Because
I mean, it solves so many problems, right? If we knew why, I suppose, right? So
yeah, exactly. And so I think one of the one of the main reasons that this occurs is because we are not sort of fundamentally, I don't know, for lack of a better term, wired to think about our future selves in the long run in a deep and meaningful way, because we never had to. From an evolutionary standpoint, I know we've been living sort of modern human lifestyles for a while in terms of our sort of worlds, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it's like a blink of an eye that we've added all these extra years to our life expectancy, right? And so when you think that, the stat that I love is that more years have been added on to average life expectancy in the last 100 years than in all of the previous millennia combined.
Yeah.
That's wild. And what that suggests is we're not kind of set up to think about the very long term because we never had to,
Yeah, true.
Now we do. And that distant version of us is pretty foreign. And we aren't really sort of hardwired to have needed to think about him.
Now, because we've got such clever people like yourself actually in this space and researching this sort of stuff, what are the kind of things that you think are the strategies, the tips to be able to short circuit and close this gap? This is not something kooky. You can actually see on neurological scans, right, that there is a disparate difference between the scans of when you're thinking about yourself versus thinking about your future self. How does this close? Have you seen that gap close?
Yes. Okay. So first off, I'll say, what we haven't seen? We haven't seen that gap close in the brain because we haven't tested that yet. But
okay.
If any of your listeners want to fund an expensive research study, be happy to take that money. What we have seen is sort of behaviorally that gap close. Now, how? Well, you start thinking about what sort of things can we do to get people to connect more to other people?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that's really the idea here. Our future self is another person. Then once you start with that question, all of a sudden it opens up all sorts of possibilities. So number one, let's make that future self more vivid, okay? Because we know that vivid examples tend to provoke behavior. You read a charity appeal, they don't give you a list of statistics. They show you a picture of someone in need because that's emotional, and emotional examples drive behavior. So let's make the future self more vivid. So we've actually worked on this in research. We've shown people age progressed images of themselves. We've done this with banks. We've done this in lab settings. I've talked to tons of people who printed out an age progressed image of themselves. That can help with a single decision. So if you are sitting down, say, with your financial advisor or, a health trainer, or you're making a big decision with your family, I think having that image of that future self there so that they literally occupy a seat at the table for this big conversation can be really helpful to more appropriately weigh out pros and cons of decisions that have impacts now and in the future.
So is this why sorry to interrupt, but is this why when we ask the question, in 10 years time, Mr. Client, what does the world look like for you? What people are in your life? Where are you spending your money? Where are you living? What are your concerns, your issues? I mean, some people find that challenging and confronting because they've never really thought about it. But what value is it in having a very deep discovery in a financial advisory context?
I think there is a huge amount of value to it. And I agree that it's a very hard thing for a lot of clients to do. I think, by the way, that there's nuance here, which is to say, I've talked to a lot of advisors who say, well, I do this. I say to them, what are your goals for the future? And I say, no, that's a different conversation. When you say, what are your goals for the future? It's abstract, and you're not talking about your future self, and you're not talking about your future family. And I think it's important, before you even get to the goals stage, I think it's important to say, who are you? Who are you going to be? Who's going to be in your life? What are you going to be doing? What's your family look like? All these questions that put some more color and concrete detail around who someone will be. The way I think about it is these decisions are negotiations. It's not a negotiation between you and your employer for a raise. It's a negotiation between you now and you in the future, and who gets the resources and where are those resources distributed. And normally that is a negotiation where one party is not sitting at the table. It's your future self. They're just not there. But if we can get them to be there sort of symbolically through a picture, through a conversation, this sort of thing, I think that's the type of thing that can actually help the conversation along. So, you asked, okay, what can we do? So I think that is one thing. We can show people what they'll look like. Along these lines, we can also write letters to or from our future selves. And boy, this has really gained a lot of popularity in the last year. There's this great website called Future Me. You can send an email and it gets delivered to your future self. You specify when. They saw an explosion of letters in the pandemic. They used to get about 3,000 letters a day. They were getting 20 to 25,000 letters in May. People want to know what life's going to be like. And it's lessens the anxiety some to think about the future and step outside of the here and now. But also having a letter written to you from your future self or writing a letter to your future self, it starts anchoring you on who that person's going to be. And again, gets you to think deeper about them. I'll give you one more thing. You can start in the future and move to the past. And let me tell you what I mean by that. That sounds a little bit abstract, but normally when we time travel, and I don't want to sound too trippy here, but
please do. I don't mind. I'm open-minded. Hit us.
Well, we think of time travel as this science fiction thing, but we travel through time all the time, so to speak, right? Now mentally, of course, right? When you think about what you're gonna have for dinner tonight, you're mentally, or lunch for you, dinner for me, right? You mentally time travel. But when you think about when's the next trip I'm gonna take, you're mentally traveling through time. We always do it in a specific way, which is that we start in the present and we time travel to the future. That just makes sense because we're anchored on the here and now. I've been doing a research study with my PhD student, a woman named Kate Christensen, and she had this brilliant idea. She said, why do we do that? Why can't we start in the future and move to the present? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, well, it's not like we have to start now and move to the future. There's nothing that says we can't anchor ourselves in the future and move backwards in time. I started thinking about it, and we started testing this idea out. We started asking people, all right, the year is 2040, travel back to 2020 or 2021. And we found that when you do that, people feel a closer connection to their future selves, and they're more likely to make positive financial decisions. We've done this with a fintech company in Sweden. We did it with a college savings startup in Southern California. And what psychologists have found is that when you drive to a new location, that always feels like it's a longer trip than when you come home. Now that's when I say always. I mean, for most people. For most people, Joseph, you could be different. And
maybe I'm really full or something like that. Who knows?
Well, normally when we go to a new location, we don't get there until we're exactly there. But when you come home, you're home, like not when you walk in the front door, but when you're like 5-10 minutes away and you start recognizing all the familiar landmarks and whatnot. And we actually think a similar thing happens when you mentally travel from the future to the present. So, So, I know this is all a little abstract, but if you boil it down.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, I'm thinking about business owners. I'm thinking about is it a kind of, can you actually draw a parallel between the way you would actually map out a business plan in the sense of actually picturing your business in the future, really understanding what your end game is? Are you a conglomerate? Are you a small practice? Are you a mid-sized business? What you want to be there and who's around, how many staff, all that sort of stuff, and then working yourself backwards. Is that the same?
Exactly. That's exactly the same. And I think, there's actually some older research suggesting that, when you kind of travel backwards, when you make a plan in reverse, it kind of frees you up to think about the obstacles that you might see along the way.
Yeah.
More so than when you go from the present to the future. So these are some of the things that we could do, like vividly think about our future selves, write a letter to or from that self, travel backwards. I'll give you one more thing that I really think is great, which is pre-commitment strategies. And this is the idea that we try to constrain our behavior between now and some future point in time. In other words, I could tell you that I'm going to run 10 miles this week, and I know I have every intention to do that. And then every day comes along and I have a new excuse as to why I can't do that. Right. And so, pre-commitment is, I'm going to make a commitment to do this sort of thing, but I'm probably also going to come up with some punishment if I don't, right? So there's a great website, stick.com with 2 Ks. You can do these things where you basically say, like this, I'm going to walk 30 minutes a day. Okay. I give it my phone info. So now it's got my GPS. It knows if I've gone for a 30-minute walk.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also give it my credit card info. And you know what? Not to get political about it, but I'll give the name of a political organization that I don't feel fondly toward.
Mm-hmm.
There's no human involved here. If I have not walked 30 minutes 5 days a week, it's going to make a donation to Donald Trump for president 2024, without me wanting it to do that.
Yeah.
And, and, and the beauty of this is that you've put basically, I think about it like bowling, when you're a kid and you go bowling and they put the bumpers on the gutters.
Yeah. Bumper bowling. Yep.
Exactly. And you're constraining where the ball can go. And here I'm constraining where my future behavior can go.
Mm-hmm.
And it rests on a sophisticated realization that there's me right now who wants to do the right thing and go for a run. And there's me at some point in the future who wants to have gone on runs. And then there's these intermediary versions of me who are going to want to sleep in and not do it.
Yeah, so completely makes sense.
How can I get those guys to go for runs? That sort of thing,
Yep. Makes sense. I just thinking to round out the sort of conversation around this, if we take a very kind of simplistic kind of idea of saving, how can we help people along the process to better save? Like what would be the tips?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think the first thing that we need to talk about is like save for what, right? So, I mean,
Sure.
right? So, and it's like, because obviously you have all different clients with different needs. And, one of the big things I see is clients who say, well, it's not about me. I'm trying to just get my college age kid to figure out how to start this process, right? And so I think for someone who's younger, maybe at the lower end of the income spectrum, not making a ton, to me, one of the best things you can do is to try to reframe savings into more manageable amounts. So, don't say save 6% of your paycheck, or don't say, I really think it's important you put aside $300 every month. Say, look, I think it's important that we figure out a way to get $10 every day or $5 every day. Is there anything that for $5 that you could not spend every day, or, something like this? I think is a great way to frame savings in a manageable bite-sized chunk. And of course, there's apps that can do this for you. To me, the important realization there is that you got to start the habit somewhere, right? And this is a habit starting thing. Now, let's move down the line. I think when it comes to saving for bigger things, I'm saving for a home remodel, I'm saving for a down payment, I'm saving for retirement. Sometimes that part of the problem is that you got a very abstract goal in mind, or rather the goal has like an abstract aspect to it. And one thing that we know that seems to work in research is by putting a name and a picture to whatever you're saving for, right? So, in fact, I recently saw on one of my investment apps that they, just rolled out the opportunity to put a picture, my own picture to each account instead of like a cartoon piggy bank. I can, pick some. It makes it real, and it makes it, it takes advantage of the mental accounts that we create.
Interesting, Hal, because like we've got this process that we go through where we ask our clients pretty specific questions around, what the future home looks like and so on. And we actually draw up a mind map and then put a picture. Now, the picture, I'm thinking from our conversation right now, I want to get the picture pretty bang on with what it is that they actually are thinking, because I think that seemingly makes a big difference. From what you're suggesting psychologically.
And by the way, think about it this way. If I had the choice between, I'm going to pull a little money out of, my kid's college account. Well, or not pull it out, but I'm not going to save as much from my kid's college account this month because, well, I've been really thinking about that new TV and I want to get it. I feel bad saying like, let's not put as much money into like college savings. But if I have a picture of my daughter and it's got her name on it, now I feel like I'm taking money from her. And that doesn't feel good,
So what you're saying is that I ask my clients for pictures of their whole family so that I can really make sure that they're all over it.
No, specifically the family members who would get the most angry at them, you know?
Yeah. Very good. Hope you're enjoying my conversation with Hal. I've been simply taken aback by the positive feedback I've received about the podcast and the guests I've had on to date. Not in my wildest dreams would I have thought that I'd be able to have a discussion like I'm having right now with Hal. Upon reviewing this episode and upon reflection, I could not help but feel that the themes discussed here are exactly the reasons for why I created It's Never About Money during the height of the Melbourne lockdown. If you're resonating with this episode, please send it to a friend or a family member that you think would really value this. For me, it was a real pleasure and a gift, and I've already made some meaningful changes in my life as a consequence. In the final part of this episode, we discuss the research that indicates how valuing our time over money has profound benefits on our level of perceived happiness, and why Hal believes the validity of his research has been highlighted and strengthened during the pandemic. Hey, change of topic, but very important. A sort of change of topic. I think we're still sort of similar, but this idea of time or money, and take us back to that time where you faced the choice between teaching versus staying at home with your newborn, and the research that was born out of that.
Well, this is now almost 5 years ago. My daughter's 5, so I'm thinking that she must have been about 5 or 6 months. I had the opportunity to do a teaching gig. I don't even remember where it was now, but it was going to pay, enough money to help out. But I'd be away from home and for a little while. And it became this interesting trade-off of, do I want more money or do I want more time? And I have a great friend and colleague at UCLA named Cassie McGillner-Holmes, and she's like one of the world's experts on happiness and well-being, and how consumers in the marketing space, and how consumers really like try to impact their own happiness. And we started realizing that, we always, many people have these trade-offs that they must make between time and money. And we often land on the money because money is quantifiable. It feels concrete, and it feels like time is something we can always make up. In other words, okay, well, maybe I don't have the time this week, but with my kid, but I'll get it next weekend. I'll get it later on. And then, well, you can sort of play these decisions out and see, well, before you know it, you've made a lot of decisions for money and there's no time left. So we went down this path where we said, little thought experiment. Let's just ask people, if you had the opportunity to have more money or more time, what would you take? Joseph, I'm curious what you would say. You could get more money.
It's probably not going to be a surprise to anyone who knows me. It'll be time. That's 100%. That's
great. We asked thousands of people, all different settings. We asked them online research samples. We asked people waiting for trains. We asked people, undergrads. Now, I should say the one caveat is that these were pretty much all Western. I think these are pretty much all North Americans. So, one thing is we haven't looked at this across the world. But, what we found is that people who said that they would rather have time than money were happier. Okay, well, you said, well, yeah, sure, just because they have the money. No. But you statistically control for money and income, right? So you say, Let's take people who have the same amount of money. Person A chooses time. He or she is happier than person B who chooses money. Now, then we said, well, okay, that's just a correlation. Does it mean anything? So we actually had, we asked people, think about what it would be like to have more time. We asked other people, write down what it would be like to have more money. And the people who wrote down more time tended to score a little higher on well-being and happiness right afterwards than the people who thought about more money. Now, there's some big caveats here, which is to say, this is very black and white, right? So part of the reason why choosing time over money is good for well-being is because of the typical reasons or the typical ways that people spend that time who choose time, right? So those who say, I'm going to spend it socially, I'm going to spend it on sort of productive pursuits,
Mm.
they tend to be happier than the people who say, I'm going to use that time, because I need it I don't know, watch TV, these sorts of things that maybe might be short term.
It seems like there must be a very strong correlation between the way a person actually appropriates their time, or puts into what they do within that allotted time, or how they think about the time. Because if you think about someone as an example who might have some addictive behaviors or non-desirable behaviors or drug addictions, they might be using work as and money as a way of distracting themselves from having more time, because having more time on their hands is probably not what they want.
That is exactly right. And in fact, Cassie and I, along with our student, who's also a professor now, Marissa Sharif at Wharton, we've hopefully, we're almost done looking at a big project examining how much time people actually have in their days, how much discretionary time they have, and how happy they are. And there's this funny thing where there's a bit of, what we call a U-shaped curve, where if you don't have any time at all, you're less happy. Then there's an interesting thing where if you have a lot of time, you're also less happy. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's unemployed. These are people who are working too, because obviously that's a different, ball of wax. But here's what's interesting. If you then start saying, well, how are people using time? It turns out that productive uses of time, or things that people deem to be productive, that now there's actually what we call a linear relationship. The more time I have to do productive things, the happier I am. Okay. And it's just like what you were saying, which is to say, how I spend it matters, and let's circle back to what we were talking about earlier. Part of the problem is that there's a lot of temptations. We were talking before about short-term gratification with money, but there's a lot of short-term gratification with time as well, right? Like you said, my phone, Instagram, another Netflix show, all those things can eat up my time really quickly. And now I've used my discretionary time, but on something that may not really have been something that I would consider productive. And don't mishear this as saying we have to spend all of our time productively all the time. That wouldn't be good either, right?
No.
You need some balance, But
it seems to me like I might be completely misguided here, but it seems to me that there's a major crossover between this time and money conversation and the future self conversation. Because if you actually are very connected to your future self and understand, what you need to do now to be able to, get somewhere in the future, then you actually have a better regard for the time that you have now as well. So that therefore means you would value it. So am I on the right path?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely on the right path. And in fact, look, I don't think this is this is a coincidence, because if you think about the two most valuable resources people have, it's probably money and time.
Yeah.
Right. And, the funny thing is that we treat these things very differently, right? So, we discount the value of money in the future, but we also really strongly discount time too. And we think, we recognize some, that there's mental accounts. We recognize if I take money out of this pocket, I'm going to have less for that pocket, but we don't think about that for time. We think, oh, well, I'm really busy right now, but then we somehow think I'll have a lot of time in the future. You look at your calendar in May and it's probably pretty empty, and you say, May will be a better month. It'll be easy. I'll have less to do.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So do you think, notwithstanding the podcast name is It's Never About Money, do you think there's a kind of, money's important. We know that. And but is it a bit of a law of diminishing returns thing, in the sense of, there's a point where, your financial resources are such that every dollar additional doesn't really contribute. Is there anything out there in terms of research that shows that?
Absolutely. So when you say that, there's actually a fascinating line of research about, the link between money and happiness, right? So, there has been debate back and forth. And so, I think one of the most interesting findings about 10 years ago, there was a study that showed that, you ask people how happy they were yesterday, because that's a pretty good measure of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Then you ask them how much money they make, what their income is. And it turns out that there is a strong relationship between how much money you make and how happy you are, but only up to a certain point. And then, as you said, there's diminishing marginal returns. So after about 75, 80K US dollars
in income,
each dollar earned doesn't have that much of an impact on your happiness. Now, this is a nuanced thing, because other researchers have found, well, the more money you have, the more satisfied you are with your lives. And there's no diminishing return there. And I think there's two important things to note here. One is there's a difference between what we call evaluative well-being and experienced well-being. So evaluative well-being is when you step back and you look at your life. This is before you go back to your high school reunion. You say, how am I doing right now? Pretty good. I feel good. I'm going to go. That's your evaluating your life. And that matters, but it's not your day-to-day experienced well-being. And your day-to-day experienced well-being is how happy you are. And money can buy positive evaluations. You know, if I step back and I say, well, I've got, you know, the car and 2 kids, and I like the neighborhood we're in and the house, that's positive evaluation. But what money can't buy is
experiential.
Yeah, it's the quality of my friendships. It doesn't buy the quality of the interactions with my spouse and kids. And
I think like the experiential side is really the side that is associated with the well-being and the physiological and health benefits rather than the evaluation. The evaluation is probably more, I suppose, point in time.
The evaluation, I think, is, you know, one way to think about it is it's actually a little, you know, it's a little bit more like stepping back and seeing the big picture. You know, the day-to-day, that sort of experienced well-being, that really matters. And here's what money can buy. Money can buy access to things, and it can buy sort of instruments to help with the day-to-day, right? So like I can use my money to buy myself a better, higher quality house and a bigger backyard, and I can use it to buy you know, more experiences. But the problem is, and where I think a lot of interesting work is being done in marketing, is the problem is people don't necessarily spend their monies in ways that maximize their well-being. In fact, you know, one of my favorite quotes from a paper was by Elizabeth Dunn and Dan Gilbert, Tim Wilson. They said, you know, if money isn't making you happy, then you're probably not spending it right. And, you know, that really resonated with me, because it's, you know, sure, you could just get more and more money, but it's what you do with that money. Of course, we know this, you know this, but it's like, and I think this is not going to be like a shocking piece of news for people, but the thing that I think is surprising is to stop and think about it. What am I doing with that money? How am I spending? You know?
And you know, in my observation of prospect clients, professionals, others that I've been across, doesn't matter the wealth spectrum, doesn't necessarily dictate my impression of their happiness. It just seems to be innately true what you're suggesting. So, but I'm wondering whether my deductive kind of reasoning is okay here, where I'm thinking, well, if you go and if success is to have more moments of happiness, and happiness is about valuing time, like happiness is about, you know, really kind of incorporating time, then do we, you know, is that what sets us up for success? Is it just include, you know, having a greater value on that time? And is
Yeah, you know, I think I think you're on the right path there. I think it's a really good, obviously it's a deep question. And I think, you know, I mean, yeah. And also like, we've got to recognize that everyone has different definitions of success. But I think if you know where you want to be and how you want to spend your time, then being able to spend the time the way that you want to spend it, to me, is a definition of success, right? So in other words, you know, I think, you know, God, it's really easy to define success in terms of how much money you make and your job title, right? But if I could say, actually, you know, what I want to be doing ideally is working 40 hours a week, and I like when I'm doing those 40 hours, or rather, what I want to be doing is to be home for dinner every night. And I can do that because I've figured out a career where I can do that, and I'm making enough money to support you know, me or whoever I need to support. Then I think that's pretty successful, right? You know, and obviously that's easier for some people and harder for others. But, you know, or if you say what I want to be doing is only be home for dinner 3 nights a week because my kids, I'm tired of them throwing food at me, you know, well, that's also.
Yeah. Do you Hal, do you think the events of the pandemic have just served to strengthen some of your conclusions in your research, or do you think things have changed? Or
I think that I just want to be careful with how I say this because the pandemic, you know, especially this week, right? We're recording this like just a few days shy of when the lockdown started in the US a year ago. And so it's, you know, it's on my mind. And I think unquestionably has been a horrible period of time and unquestionably has been tragic in too many ways we can even count. And yet I think there's been these, you know, silver linings, so to speak. One of which is, I think it's created like the most massive natural experiment in a resetting of priorities and a focus on time and a focus sort of away from the sort of standard typical way of living that, you know, that we've ever seen and may never see again, right? In that regard, I think that the conclusions, you know, of some of my own work have, you know, never been stronger, or put another way, I think some of these issues have never been more important, which is to say, focus on the priorities, focus on what matters and what's important right now. And I think we've seen that, you know, you know, the data is still out, right? The jury's still out. There's so much research being done right now, and I can't even keep up with it. But it will be interesting to see whether priorities have shifted, whether temporal focus has shifted, and how long that will last. Because it's, you know, people habituate, and I think it'll be easy for people once things kind of open up. It'll be easy to not look back because you don't want to look back.
True. Do you, what's the one thing that you wish to ensure, you know, our listeners really, you know, have heard from this particular episode?
Okay. I think the one thing that I think is important to note is that we are a collection of separate selves over time. We are different people over time. And the lesson is not that we need to prioritize the future self. I think the lesson is that we need to figure out ways to inject more balance between our various selves over time. Our self of today, our self of tomorrow, our self from the distant tomorrow. You know, I think that, to me, having that conversation, having that focus is the thing that's going to most effectively make sure that people have, you know, how do I say it? Effectively maximize utility, or, you know, put another way, I think, you know, have the best shot at happiness over time.
Yeah, makes sense. And what's still to do in your research? What's the next thing?
Okay, yeah. Next thing for me, I'll tell you a project I've just started with a couple students that I'm really into right now, which is we started asking people what they'd want to know if they could know anything about the future. And you know, it's not totally sci-fi because there's so many you know, big data sources we can use now to actually tell people what their future will look like. And there's actually, you know, I think this is not just a sort of silly academic question. There's lots of things that people could learn about their own behaviors, their health, their relationships that they could change, but they might not want to know. You know, if I told you, you are on the path for divorce right now unless you do these things, or if I told you you're on the path for early onset dementia and you can make that happen a little later if you do these things, would you want to know? And how best to communicate that information to you. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out, because, you know, if I walked up to someone on the street, said, you're probably going to die pretty soon unless you do this thing. Nobody would want to talk to me. I listened to this uh, just absolutely fascinating podcast about a woman who essentially has this extraordinarily strong sense of smell, and she can smell disease markers. And
Far out.
right,
Really?
the only way she knew
Incredible.
this is she kept saying that her husband um, uh, developed a strange smell, and it was years and years, and he said nobody else smells it, and then and then he developed Parkinson's, and they they were grappling with it, and then they decided to go to a meeting of of patients with Parkinson's and their caregivers, and she said, "Oh my God, everybody in the room smells this way," and they realized that she could sort of smell the markers of Parkinson's. So they did this fascinating research study. She worked with a doctor who treated patients with Parkinson's, and he said, I'm going to take t-shirts from people with the disease and those without. And she smelled them, and she was able to identify 100% of the patients with Parkinson's. And then she had one miss. She identified one of the control patients as being with Parkinson's. I said, well, that's pretty amazing. And then about 8 months later, the doctor's giving a talk about this, and this guy walks up to him and says, I know you were my doctor. I was in your study, but you've got to move me over. I actually, sadly, have been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And they realized his was the t-shirt that she misdiagnosed. So she smelled it on him before he was even diagnosed with it. And you think about this, and the reason I'm going down this rabbit hole with you is to say, there are ways that you can know someone's future.
Wow.
And so she has this power where she can walk into a room, and she could tell you, you smell, she knows certain diseases now, and she could tell someone well before they're at a clinical level of diagnosis that they are going to have this thing happen in their future. And how do you convey that to people? Would they want to know? And what sort of information do you give them?
Well, the option, having the option. I mean, just having the option. It's incredible, right? So this work must be amazingly meaningful for you, and certainly meaningful for society. It's amazing. Look, last question. I find it important. I ask a lot of the interviewees at the end this particular question, but I'm really excited about this one with you. What animal would you be now, and why? And then as a follow-up, which I never really ask, what would your future self animal be?
Which animal would I be? Oh my God, that's a funny question.
Yeah,
man, I have not given this much thought. That is such a good question. Well, I let me think about it for 1 minute, because I'm staring at our dog right now, and he, I'm a little jealous of his life because he spends most of it curled up in a ball sleeping. That looks appealing. I actually think that's my future self, because right now I'd like to be doing stuff and out there and active, and so at the same time, I don't want to have to worry too much. So I guess I would probably be like a lion, because I feel like,
Right now you'd be a lion?
Yeah, I think I'd like to be a lion, because I don't have to worry about too many people taking me down. I'm
You're the king of the jungle. You're the king of the jungle.
Yeah, I'm the king of the jungle, but I also can take a day-long nap, But in the future, maybe I'd like to be like a nice, well cared for dog. Someone else taking care of me. I can sleep when I want. But our dog only gets food every twice a day. So I'd like to get a little bit more.
Get some more, sustenance. No worries. Well, I mean, this has been really amazing. It's been amazing to listen to it and to feel validated in some of the things that I've been thinking are true about the way that we work with our clients, and improving some aspects out the back of this conversation. I'm sure there'll be a lot of financial advisors listening in thinking, wow, that really does make a lot of sense. We need to amend some of our, questioning and processes around it. And I know there'll be a lot of business owners thinking about, do I take bonuses in money, or do I take bonuses in time? And what do I do with that time? Really helpful to a lot of people. And I'm really, really encouraged by the research as well that you're doing going forward. It's some really valuable stuff there. And thank you for taking the time. I know it's taken a bit for you to do this for us, so appreciate it.
Hey, Joseph, thank you so much for having me. And I love your questions. It's a great conversation. Thank you.
I hope that this one was enjoyable to listen to and there were some moments of value. If you have resonated in any way with the sentiments of this podcast, we would be delighted to direct you to our website, www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au, for more free resources and education aimed at improving your capacity to make sound financial decisions for the benefit of your family. We wish you every success, however you define it.